Welcome to the Darwinian Delusions channel. Today we're going to be talking about something which is very important, and I have with me a special guest, Hamza Sotsis. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you doing?
I'm very well.
So I've got a topic which I think is really interesting. Now you've been in this field of tackling atheists for, I think 10 years, something like this. So we want to talk about why atheists preach from a psychological perspective, but also from an evolutionary perspective. So just to get the ball rolling, just think about this idea. Now, if we are the product of natural selection, and natural selection is there to help us survive and reproduce, that's all that there is. So as Richard Dawkins says in The Selfish Gene, there is no higher rationale to life except to pass on your genes. So from a Darwinian perspective, why would someone who believes that there is no God spend so much time trying to show that there is not a God? And in fact, we can look at it from another perspective, which is some evolutionary psychologists, they say religion came about, or the belief in God came about, to help with social cohesion. But if that is the case and it's adaptive, then why would you argue against something that's actually adaptive from your own worldview? So let's start off firstly on the psychological side of things. You've seen a lot of atheists who are very passionate, full of energy. Why do you think from a psychological perspective they want to push atheism?
Well, human beings like the truth. They like to share things. So my children, for example, if they were to see a spider on the floor, what do they say? Hey, Baba, it's a spider, it's a spider. So naturally we have this inclination to share things and even to talk about things that we value and things that we believe to be true.
Yeah.
I mean, you even see this from a kind of social point of view. It's the World Cup at the moment. People want to support their team. For example, I'm supporting England, right? It's coming home. So from that point of view, you value the team in some form and you want to talk about it, and maybe you might debate over lunch or dinner or whatever the case may be and say, I think they're going to win because of Lingard, he's a player, or whatever the case may be. So we want to share and talk about things that we value, and we also want to promote the truth, what we consider to be true. So
Okay. That's the answer they would sort of try and give.
well, no, that's the answer I'm giving. That's the answer that I'm giving. So when you just look at the human being as the human being is,
They want to share the truth.
they want to share the truth. They want to talk about things that they value, and they want to share. Just generally speaking, we have this inclination to share things that we believe to be true, that we value, and we think are quite interesting. So, I mean, you can just tell. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but just from a layman sitting on the couch approach, that's the nature of the human being. Now, you may argue, is that compatible with the Darwinian mechanism?
And also, is it compatible to speak about truth? Because here's a very interesting point. If we are there purely to survive and reproduce, and that is the reason why we exist, that's why we pass on our genes, that's why we do everything that we actually do, then does truth actually matter, or should we just speak about survival? This is a very interesting
Yeah, I
point.
agree. Well, it depends how they would define truth. But if they mean truth, a representation of the actual state of affairs, then I would argue that the Darwinian mechanism, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, by the way, you are, yeah, so correct me, that it's compatible and incompatible in some way. What I mean is that truth does not necessitate survival.
Yes.
Because that's the whole point of the Darwinian mechanism.
Break
right?
that down a little bit, because I think
Well, basically, yeah. Well, what a Darwinist would argue,
Yeah.
or someone who believes in the mechanism, they would basically say that, of course, we can explain truth. We can explain truth because knowing the truth, right, understanding the actual state of affairs, leads to survival. So
Yep.
they're giving us some kind of necessary link between truth, our rational faculties that can come to the truth, and survival. Okay. I may agree that there could be some instances when you know the truth, you know the actual state of affairs, it may lead to survival, but it doesn't necessarily lead to survival, and that's the point. So what I would argue is what Professor O'Brien and Professor O'Hare, they give some very interesting thought experiments, and they would basically say, well, you can have non-truths, untruths, false beliefs, and lead to survival. For example, if I'm a jungle man, I go into the jungle and I have the false belief, I even use logic, for example, in a wrong way, invalid reasoning, and I come to the conclusion that all fungi are poisonous. What happens, bro? I survive.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? It means false beliefs, not having a representation of the state of affairs, can lead to survival, because you know that some fungi are actually good for you.
Yeah.
Mushrooms are very good for you. Button mushrooms and the other mushrooms that we have in a barbecue, what they're called? Portobello mushrooms, right? So we've just challenged the idea.
Yeah.
So the problem here is there's nothing necessary about truth or understanding the actual state of affairs and survival.
Yeah. And interestingly,
So why would we even trust our minds then?
Yeah.
Because it could have been, evolutionary history could have been that along the way, bro, that we basically had all these bunch of false beliefs. We didn't have an understanding of the actual state of affairs. Yeah, we were surviving.
yeah.
It could be the case.
But somebody could make a counter argument. Let's tease this out a little bit and say, well, the very fact that we are surviving, those beliefs are more likely to be true, because you're more likely to survive in true beliefs than false beliefs.
Well, how do you know? How do you know you're more likely?
Because I'm alive.
Yeah, but that has an assumption. The assumption is that you're just basically arguing in a circle, because you're basically saying, well, knowing the actual state of affairs, knowing true beliefs, you're more likely to survive, which you're assuming that truth leads to survival again. But we've already broken that down. You're just going back in a circle again. We're saying, no, we're saying there could be many instances where not knowing the actual state of affairs, in other words, not knowing the truth and following false beliefs, can lead to survival. So why are you assuming that, well, the more I know about the truth, the more I can survive? You're just assuming this thing that we've just dealt with.
All right, perfect. So that's dealt with, but let's take the argument to another level. Now, in the beginning, when I said, why do atheists preach, you gave a very surface level answer, and we're going to break that down. So you said people value sharing the truth. Oh my God, it's a spider, right? This sort of thing. So if that's the case, people value and they have values, then all human values should be broken down to something which helps us survive and reproduce too. You can't just have an abstract idea of, I have these values. Like nowadays, there's a lot of discussion about rights. You know, we have this right and that right. But fundamentally, rights have to be broken down into something else less to them, a sort of philosophy or contract. And that has to be linked, obviously, to survival. So we can't just accept a value without looking at, okay, how does this value actually fit within your overall paradigm?
Okay.
So when it comes to truth, I may say, well, Mr. Atheist, that's interesting that you say I value truth. Fantastic. But how does you valuing truth link to your own survival? Because at the end of the day, you can survive on true beliefs or false beliefs. So why is it intrinsically that truth has a value that you would give up a belief which helps you survive, which may be detrimental to yourself, to value truth? And so let me give you a practical example of that. Someone would speak the truth, and that knowing that speaking the truth would lead to their death.
Yes.
And this can happen when you have revolutions. and you have
Socrates.
you have somebody who challenges the status quo. But how do you explain that from a
Yeah,
Darwinian
agreed.
perspective?
I actually agree with you. So this is like as if we're designed to discover.
Yeah.
So basically, you have people going on the top of mountains and losing their fingers because of frostbite, and
Yeah.
some of them not even reaching the top of the mountain, because we have this kind of desire to discover.
Yeah.
And it's in all human beings. Actual fact, science wouldn't really work if we weren't motivated in that way.
Yeah.
But that motivation itself, we're designed in some way, you know, and I'm using design loosely, we're designed to discover the truth, and in that discovery can go against our need for survival.
Right.
So it seems that there's an incompatibility between
Sure.
our innate desire to discover the truth and survival itself.
Sure, but I can say to you, okay, that's fine. You're claiming there's an incompatibility, but I can give you a scenario within which we can explain this incompatibility. So
Okay.
natural selection has certain constraints. For example, fruit flies or flies, they need to find out which area is humid. Now, natural selection could have given them humidity detectors, but it didn't. Natural selection instead gave them detection of light, so that they go to darker areas, and darker areas are more likely to be humid. So there's an indirect solution. So natural selection can give you maladaptive behavior, and this type of Darwinian behavior which seems non-adaptive, this is just evolution going off at a tangent.
Okay.
That's all it is. So we can actually explain it.
I don't have a response.
Okay.
I have a thought about it. What was your
Well,
response?
okay.
Assumingly you know an answer since you asked the question.
Yeah, because we
Yeah.
actually spoke about this in the other day. In the
Oh,
office.
do we?
Yes,
Oh,
we
right,
did.
I forgot.
Okay.
Sorry.
You can give a scenario within a paradigm, which is sometimes known as a just so story.
Yes.
So a just so story is a scenario which is consistent with natural selection.
Yes.
But as we spoke about,
But is that a just so story?
yes, because a just
Because they're actually empirically observing it. They see that these fruit flies have these light sensors.
I wasn't talking about the fruit flies. I was
Okay.
talking about maladaptive behavior.
Okay,
So,
sure.
for example, when you come across adaptive behavior, you say natural selection, right? You know that video I put on the channel about mankind being thrown off the ring, right?
Yeah.
That wrestler. So somebody put up a comment, oh, we can easily explain this because he's, going to get $15 million for that fall, right? So if you remember, we discussed this. We said, well, okay, that's fine. What if he didn't get $15 million for that fall? What if he's just doing it for the hell of it? So if somebody...
Which many people do, by the way.
Which they actually do. So it's quite easy to say, when you see adaptive behavior, say, Hamza, look, natural selection is true. When you see maladaptive behavior, you say, well, that's natural selection not working. But the problem with that is, how do you test? I'm not talking about falsification here, but a theory has to be testable. So now we're getting into the realm of, okay, how do you even test something when you could always come up with a scenario, which is what Stephen Jay Gould said, and he came up with the term just so stories, that you can come up with an infinite set of empirically equivalent just so stories for that discrepancy.
So adding more assumptions to the equation, basically.
Yeah.
Well, one would argue we have a very good theory that is confirmed by some empirical evidence. It has some gaps. There are some loose ends, for example. There are some broken links, but generally speaking, it's the best that we have. And I think that response actually
Makes
proves
sense.
our point.
Yeah.
Because what we argue all the time is, well, the Darwinian mechanism is probabilistic, based on assumptions, and it has some disputes. We're not saying it's absolutely wrong. We're not saying you should reject it practically. We're saying what some popularizers do. What we're saying is don't adopt the narrative of some popularizers, which they come across psychologically as this is the only way forward, and it's as believing as the sun is spherical, the moon is round, or the earth is round. So I like those type of responses because it actually shows out exactly. So you agree that it's the best that we have,
Okay.
but it's not the absolute truth.
So
But that's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, though, in the philosophy of science, there's nothing wrong with a well-confirmed theory
Yeah.
actually bringing other assumptions
Yeah.
into the play just to preserve the theory, because it's the best that we have. There is nothing in the evidence that we see that totally go against our kind of narrative. That's what they would argue. So what's wrong with throwing in there a few more assumptions just to preserve the theory so far? And this is why eventually you have paradigm shifts in scientific thinking, because when you keep on adding more assumptions, it actually eventually breaks down,
Yeah.
and then you have something totally different.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about these assumptions is that using the word assumptions really actually teases off some Darwinists sometimes.
Why?
Like for example,
Well, they should study the philosophy of
yeah,
science.
it doesn't have assumptions. It doesn't have. They don't like the word. But what's
Well,
interesting?
frankly, I just think that's ignorant.
Yeah.
That means they haven't studied the philosophy of science, because science itself is based on a whole range of assumptions. We're
Yeah.
not saying they're invalid assumptions. We're not saying you shouldn't have them as first principles in order for your knowledge to grow in that particular sphere of knowledge. Of course, you have to adopt assumptions for everything.
Yeah,
But to say there are no assumptions, I just think that's evangelical.
yeah, it is. And what's interesting, and I spoke about this before, but it's interesting to tease it out because you study the philosophy of science. So it's very interesting that, number one, scientists generally aren't aware of philosophy of science, right? And that could be a problem.
Well, they are, but they haven't studied it on a level which would maybe bring to the forefront of their mind all the kind of fuzzy areas in the philosophy of science. Like, there are assumptions,
Yeah.
Induction doesn't lead to certainty, falsification, falsified theories can be revived if you change the auxiliary assumptions.
And that's almost like blasphemous when you say that.
Well, for some scientists, but
Yeah.
maybe the popularizers. But if you go to any academic institution in the UK, speak sincerely to a scientist, and if they've done a PhD, for example, at least they will know there's something going on in the philosophy of science. So,
Yeah.
and they would even know that theories are not representation of the actual state of affairs, even if they're scientific realists. Because the current debate...
Okay, wait, break
Sorry.
that down. You need to break down the difference between realists and
Yeah,
instrumentalists.
so
or
for example, you have the realists and the anti-realists. I'm not going to talk about the instrumentalists for now. Let's just take the two camps. So the realists say that scientific theories can be a representation of the actual state of affairs,
Yeah.
meaning they are truth, they lead to truth. The anti-realists say no, they're just workable models that explain our perceptions of reality, which could be wrong, basically. Yeah, they've had a debate for a few years, right? Yes, theories, welcome from theories can lead to truth. Welcome from theories do not lead to truth. It's our interpretation of the reality. Blah 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 blah. There's a big debate. Now they've come to a conclusion. Generally speaking, what's that conclusion? They could all be wrong. Theories can change, even if you're a realist. Even if you believe scientific well-confirmed theories can be a representation of the actual state of affairs, they would still argue, but they can change and they can be wrong. So even in the most well-known understanding and grounding of scientific theories, things can fluctuate.
Okay.
This doesn't mean we reject a well-confirmed theory.
Of course.
This is a philosophical discussion. Practically, you accept a well-confirmed theory.
Yeah.
Not to do so, you'll see there. For example, I read a book, How Not to Die, by Dr. Gregor. It's great.
Sounds like a good book.
Obviously, he says you're going to die, but there are some, preventable diseases like heart disease if you have a plant-based whole food diet. That was based on double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, blah, 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 blah. And they were not, funded by the food industry. It's very robust research, even on a popular level. I know science changes. I know scientific theories can change. I know induction doesn't lead to certainty. There could be a future scientific investigation conclusion, whatever the case may be, that can contradict our current conclusions. But I've adopted what that book has advised.
Right.
So I've adopted it. But do I now say this basically formulates my creed and my first principles to life? Of course not.
Okay.
There's a difference.
So
they have epistemic weight.
Absolutely. Now bringing that discussion back to the original question about why atheists preach. No, this is absolutely linked. Now I'm going to give you a statement of Richard Dawkins, and I don't think I mentioned this to you before, so it'll be quite good. So we know.
Make sure you reference it. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So we know the epistemic weight of scientific theories, and we know that they're not absolutely certain, which is why we did the whole discussion about the philosophy of science. Now, this is what he actually said in public, and I found this very interesting. He was actually having an interview with Lawrence Krauss, and he said, look, evolution does not undermine the existence of God, but there is a public perception that it actually does. Since my aim is to kill religion, all I need to do is convince them of evolution and they'll become atheists.
You don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. Now, if your aim is to propagandize in favor of evolution, that obviously is the best seduction technique. But if your aim is to kill religion, as mine is, then just let me finish. If your aim is to kill religion, then since evolution is manifestly true, then if there are people out there who really believe that that if you are an evolutionist, you've got to be an atheist, then all I've got to do is to persuade them of evolution, which should be comparatively easy, since the evidence is overwhelming, and I'll turn them all into atheists.
So, what do you think is the actual motive behind that? Because that is actually something, if you really break it down, that's very Machiavellian, it's very Marxist, it's a very deep psychological ploy he's using.
Taking your word for it, I haven't seen what he said, but say he did say that.
We're going to reference him.
Yeah, we can reference it. I do believe you, but just, you could be wrong. We forget sometimes. If he did say that, then judging by other work that he's done, I would argue, well, let's just be honest, he's ideological. What can we do? He's ideological in his approach. So, the professor of my department, when I did my MA in philosophy, was Professor James. He's an atheist. He's a Nietzschean scholar. He is one of the leading... He's a scholar that didn't write a book, yet he became a professor. That's how good he is. And usually, when you become a professor, you have to write a book.
Yeah.
He didn't write a book. That's how good he is. And we had lunch, and he's a phenomenal person. He believes God doesn't exist. Probably doesn't exist because of the problem of evil. Fair enough. That's a different discussion. But he said to me, and he gave me advice. He said, don't debate these evangelical atheists. We don't like them.
As in the atheist community.
The atheist community, the academic atheists, we don't like these people. almost they're like glib. They're not nuanced. Like Nietzsche was nuanced, right?
Yeah.
Arthur Schopenhauer, he understood the philosophical implications of denying God. The world is just chaotic. He even said that I wish the world never existed. He wrote an essay on suicide, right? Now, the point I'm trying to say here is he gave me the advice saying don't fall for that trap. And to be honest, we've fallen for that mistake in the past.
Yeah.
And we're trying to learn from that. Human beings are human beings. We're not intellectual robots. We're not based on some kind of philosophical algorithm that we make conclusions. It's very messy and fuzzy. We're emotional, we're psychological. Even from the Islamic perspective, we believe we are ruh, we are a soul, we have a qalb, we have a heart, we have an aql, an intellect, which is a function of the heart, the aql. We have a fitra, the innate disposition that has proto-primary knowledge, which is to acknowledge God and to worship Him. This is the human being as the human being is. Now, just throwing some intellectual arguments to that human being, it's just not going to work. It's not going to filter through. And if it does, it might crumble after. So the point here is, his advice was, don't take them seriously. Don't engage with them. Talk to them about value. That's what he said to me. Talk to them about meaning and value. Because he appreciates that without the metaphysic of the divine, then really, do you have absolute value? Can you even value truth? What does value mean?
Yeah.
And that's a big question, bro. Like, how can I value your life? Now, I can intuitively and emotionally. I'm not saying atheists are not allowed to value. Of course they are. But philosophically, how do they ground that?
Yeah.
If we are essentially based on a naturalistic universe, in other words, if we adopt philosophical naturalism, that everything can be explained, all phenomena can be explained via physical processes, which are further reduced to physical bits of matter, then how can we claim ultimate value, bro?
Yeah.
And that's why you mentioned human rights earlier. Jeremy Bentham, I believe, said, according to this view, it's nonsense on stilts. It's nonsense on stilts. I think even Dan Dennett, one of the Four Horsemen, he quotes Jeremy Bentham, I believe, and mentions that. Because it's true. If it's just physical processes, bro, that have no intrinsic ultimate value. There's an electron whizzing around. Why are you whizzing around, electron? I don't know. My name is Mr. Random. Right? He doesn't know. He's all over the place. And he has no value himself. He can't even speak to you anyway, unless you're a panpsychist, but that's a different story in consciousness, right? So if you believe in panpsychism, you believe in electrons have a primary form of consciousness. So, electrons feel pain and they can fall in love, and that's a different topic. But the point is, fundamentally, according to philosophical naturalism, it's reduced to nothing.
Absolutely.
So how you ask? Look, say you're an atheist. Okay, Mr. Atheist, how you doing? Well done. Hope you're well. Love you to bits. You believe in human rights. You believe in universal human rights. You believe in a key human right of life, the right to life. I agree with that. You agree with that. Good. Philosophically ground it according to philosophical naturalism.
Well,
ground it. Do it for me.
This is the thing. What I like,
or even Darwinism.
Yeah. What I like is that some honest atheists, they actually put it the way it actually is. So Yuval Noah Harari, he's written that famous book Sapiens, right? And what he says is this. He says there is no gods in the universe, there is no rights, no laws, no morals, no civilization, nothing. There is absolutely no fundamental rights outside of the common imagination of human beings. So he's just being honest.
Like Dawkins said, it's pitless indifference.
Yeah, it's just... But that is, if you really believe that, this is, I think, a good point to end upon. If atheists were actually consistent and they actually believed the implications of atheism, they would never preach atheism.
I agree.
Because it would make a difference.
I agree. Viktor Frankl, he was an amazing writer. He was actually a victim of Nazi Germany.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
And this leads to suffering as well. And he makes a really good point. He says, if you find meaning in your suffering, it's no longer suffering.
Yeah.
And life, and that's what the religious people tell you all the time. Life is full of suffering in some way. But what religion does, and adopting a metaphysic, which obviously we can justify, gives meaning to that suffering. So suffering no longer becomes suffering from that point of view. But from the atheist perspective, where is the meaning in the suffering? And that's a big question as well. And that's why people at home, forget what they say on YouTube, yeah? Let's not judge people on YouTube comments and Facebook and how they smile and the kind of false veneer. At home, when you're all alone, when your friends are not there, your phone's off, and you're just thinking about yourself, your reality, whatever the case may be. Tell me, what meaning do you find in your suffering from an atheistic point of view? What meaning do you find in you believing that things have ultimate value, even though everything is really based on pitness of difference? Tell me. And those are big questions. So as religious people, we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be arrogant about things, but we should help people understand the logical implications of certain worldviews. If they don't like it, well, let's not be sentimental about it. Either change your worldview or basically change your sentiments about life. It's simple as that. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
There you
Absolutely.
go.
We went off. I mean, this for me, I think, is the most fundamental point that it breaks down to when we have the discussion about theism or atheism, value.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean fundamentally? Because we're going to probably do this in another show, speak about first principles and what it leads to. But when all the dust is settled from intellectual gymnastics, it's about value and what it means to be human.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show. Inshallah, we're going to have you on
Anytime,
further
bro.
shows.
Thanks.
For more videos about Darwinian evolution, why it's based on a probabilistic framework, why it has multiple assumptions and there's disputes at a conceptual and a scientific level in terms of its most fundamental ideas, make sure you subscribe to Darwinian Delusions.